Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Handling Sensitive Calls with Limited English Proficient Consumers. My name is Becky and I will be moderating this event. At Lionbridge request, this call is being recorded. Attendees are currently in listen-only mode and do have the opportunity to submit questions via the chat box during the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers, Susan and Allie. Thank you. You may now begin.
Hi, everybody. How are you? I'm so glad to be here today. We are presenting on sensitive calls with limited English proficient consumers. I'm Allie Fritz. I'm the Director of Operations for our Telephonic Interpretation Service here at Lionbridge. I'm responsible for all the delivery of our interpreter services to a wide variety of clients. And I've been here for about 10 years in a variety of roles, so I'm really pleased to share some of what we know about interpreting with you today. And I have here with me Susan Grider.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Grider. Very nice to have you all here. I'm the Director of OPI Sales for Lionbridge. I've been with the company since 1997, and I've worked in the OPI arena in a lot of different areas, including program management and quality assurance, before moving to the sales side. So very pleased to talk to you today about sensitive calls. So first of all, just to let you know what we'll be talking about today, we'll start off with a brief review of what OPI is, just a couple of minutes to make sure everybody is familiar with how we do things in general in the industry and also at Lionbridge. We'll talk about what makes a call sensitive. We'll talk about the importance of fairness and the perception of fairness to the limited English proficient person, and we'll talk about the role of each party and go through some case studies. So now Allie will take you through the definitions.
Great. So we just want to define the terms as we're going to be using them in the presentation today. OPI, for over-the-phone interpretation, of course, we're referring to an interpreter on the phone. We are specifically talking about an on-demand style service in this presentation. So needing an interpreter right away, calling into your language service provider and getting the first available interpreter. So we'll be referring to that situation as OPI. The LEP is the term we'll be using for your limited English proficient speaker. That would be your customer or patient, constituent, whoever it is that needs your interpreter that you're working with. We're going to be referring to your employee or your person handling the call as the agent. So the agent speaks English, the interpreter speaks both languages, and the LEP speaks the non-English or target language. Just to also clarify, we will be using the word interpreter as opposed to translator. Typically in the industry, interpreter refers to somebody speaking oral message interpretation versus a translator is somebody who's working in written documents. So those are our definitions today. If anything else is unclear, please feel free to type that in the chat box as we go along. Again, just to review a traditional OPI service workflow, what we're talking about here is that an LEP customer of yours, doesn't speak English again, contacts you needing service, and your agent will add your interpretation service provider to a call. So it's going to be a three-way conference call. So your agent will be dialing Lionbridge, for example, and we will add the interpreter to the line. Then when everybody's on the line together, the interpreter will be speaking in the consecutive mode, which means that there'll be pauses between each sentence or every few sentences. So you'll hear, English from the agent, and then Spanish from the interpreter, and then Spanish from the LEP, and then English from the interpreter, back and forth like that. And of course, this would be the same call flow if your agent initiates the call to Lionbridge and then adds the LEP later. Same thing, just want to clarify that the situation we're talking about today is going to be a three-way call where your agent has added an interpreter to the line at some point during that workflow.
So what kind of calls can be sensitive? We all think of medical calls as something that could be sensitive, but interpreters work in customer service, in tech support, in government services, and really in terms of what kind of call can be sensitive, any call can be sensitive when an interpreter is involved. The nature of the call is sensitive, and it's made more acute by the fact that the person on the phone has limited English skills. For example, any medical call can be sensitive, and obviously that's even more so in the time of COVID, particularly around testing and vaccine availability. But also in tech support, customers can get frustrated when it takes a while or the call contains information that they don't understand. And in customer service, customers are often upset by billing issues, and that can make the call very sensitive. And in government calls, really many high stress situations occur, from CPS and domestic abuse calls to unemployment, legal issues, again, COVID issues, vaccine concerns. All of those are types of calls that ramp up the anxiety no matter who's on the line. When you add a limited English speaker to the call, that person by nature will feel at a disadvantage. They might wonder, is the interpreter really representing what I said correctly? And if they have no English at all, they really won't know. So it's a big unknown for them. They might worry that the interpreter is biased against them for some reason, or has their own agenda in the call. They might worry if the agent is going to take them seriously since they're not speaking in English and using an interpreter. And bottom line, they really worry, will I get the help I need? Will I get my call resolved as I need it?
So let's talk about how we can mitigate those concerns. And the first way is with the interpreter. The role of the interpreter is a really important piece of any call, but especially a sensitive call. And we just want to define for you what you can expect from your interpreter every time. The first mission of the interpreter, of course, is to interpret accurately and completely. That would be the industry standard. A standard interpretation being full and complete is a term you may hear. Everything else that we're talking about on this slide is secondary to accuracy for all parties, of course. The interpreter should be speaking in the first person. By this we mean if the agent says, for example, "Hi, how can I help you today?" The interpreter will say, "Hi, how can I help you today?" The interpreter is not going to say, "She says, hi, how can I help you today? She wants to know what she can do for you." The interpreter should be relaying everything just as it's said by the original speaker. The only exception to that is if they're referring to themselves, the interpreter, and that's what they'll say. They'll speak of themselves in the third person. So they would say, for example, the interpreter requests a repetition of the previous statement, or they might say something like, "This is the interpreter," and then speak briefly in the first person. That helps to cut down on confusion about who's representing which statement, which of course is extremely important in a difficult or sensitive call. If somebody's saying, "I'm so upset," we need to be sure that that's the LEP, not the interpreter who's talking. So making sure that your interpreters are following good protocol around that is really important. Another job of the interpreter is to convey the register and the emotion of the speech accurately. By register, we mean that if somebody is using slang, for example, the interpreter should choose a slang word in the other language. An emotion, of course, that the tone of their voice should reflect the tone of the person who's speaking. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, because obviously in a difficult call or a sensitive call, the emotions can get heightened. So what should the interpreter do? We'll come back to that in a minute. The interpreter, really important, should avoid engaging directly with the LEP. They may need to, or the agent may want them to, and that's different. But if the interpreter is having a side conversation in language with either party without relaying all the pieces of that conversation, it creates the appearance that something is going wrong or that there's something happening that not everybody's aware of. So that it's the interpreter's job to be very clear about where the speech is coming from and that they interpret everything that's going on. Finally, the interpreter should inform the agent of any issues that they're having. They should be especially speaking up about anything that's affecting the call quality in the case of OPI. So if there is background noise or if there's static on the line, the interpreter would say something like, "The interpreter is having trouble understanding the LEP. would you please request that they switch headsets or something like that. Again, speaking of themselves in the third person, but really important that the interpreter bring that up rather than try to battle through a difficulty and then sacrifice accuracy for that. So in addition to being a well-trained interpreter, an interpreter who knows their job well, the other piece is that interpreters need to be prepared. And what we have on the screen for you are ways that you can help your interpreters handle your calls as best they can. We're looking for anything that you can provide to your interpreters in advance that is going to make your call go more smoothly. So some examples are, for example, a call script. If your agents are following a script, give the whole thing to your language service provider if you can. We know that some scripts are very complicated, but anything that's standard, openings, closings, anything that is going to happen on every call, you should give that to your language service provider, and they'll give that to the interpreter to study. And the same with the other types of examples we have up here. Forms that are going to be filled out during the call by the agent or the interpreter, by the LEP rather. Glossaries, anything that's internal to your company that defines common terms for your company that other people may not know about, or acronyms, same thing. Whether that glossary is in English only or it's just a list of terms, more is more with interpreters. It's their job to translate the glossary for you, or your language service provider company may do that so that everybody has access to the same terminology list. Screenshots can be important if you have your agent in a specific computer software program. They need to fill out certain fields. It can help the interpreter to be able to follow along with what they're doing. Or perhaps it's the website that your LEP consumer is visiting. If it's your company's website or your state agency's website, for example, they need to be navigating. It can help to at least have those links or screenshots of what the LEP may be looking at. That will give context to the interpreter for the call. And finally, really important is if there are any long authorizations or disclosures that are going to need to be read during the call. This is especially true of these types of calls we're talking about today with sensitive information. You may need your LEP to agree to disclose certain information or authorize that another party can have access to information or authorize consent for any number of things. Those long paragraphs can be a real stumbling block if the interpreters aren't prepared. Your agent needs to either pause every few sentences if you haven't provided that disclosure in advance to make sure that it's being relayed really accurately. Or, if you are confident that your interpreters do have access to your authorizations, then they can really go through that in language with the LEP quickly. That's going to cut down on your handle time for the call. So it's always recommended to just work with your language service provider, get as much content to them as you can, because the interpreters really do study it. I know some of our interpreters print out every single thing we give them, and they have these huge binders organized by client name. Some prefer electronic versions, and we keep access to those available for our interpreters all the time, but that's what makes them feel good about the call, and that's what's going to make your agent and your LEP feel good about the call too. So just to summarize, from the interpreter perspective, a prepared interpreter handles sensitive calls the best. They'll be ready with the terminology they need, and that will make your LEP confident. So you're going to have an experienced, prepared interpreter. It's going to make the whole call go smoothly, and it's especially important when you're dealing with a sensitive or difficult subject matter.
So let's take a look at the other person in this interaction, the agent, who in many senses is serving as the traffic cop of the interaction. There are steps that the agent can take to support an interpreted call, particularly a sensitive one, and manage its tone. And those are, first of all, to make sure that they identify everyone on the call. It's disconcerting for the LEP who may not know if there are multiple parties on the call, and just to inspire confidence and create a environment where the LEP is comfortable, the agent should identify everybody on the call. Another thing that creates additional stress is pauses, and the agents should explain any pauses that happen, for example, if they're typing or looking up information. This just makes the LEP feel a little more comfortable. Provide any instructions to the interpreter that the agent would want, such as spelling out of names at the beginning of the call. And really important is for the agent to remember that this is being interpreted and control the flow. So keep utterances to 2 or 3 sentences at a time so that the interpreter has time to work. Ask the participants not to speak over each other if the discussion becomes heated. And again, just serve as that traffic cop for the interaction. And finally, the agent should remember to pause for the interpreter to work, breathe, be as relaxed as possible. Our interpreters say that the best sensitive calls are handled by an agent who remains calm and remains in control of the discussion. So how will your LEP perceive the call? This is very important because the perception of the call as fair or unfair really governs whether the LEP feels that they have been well served by the call and they've gotten their information across. It has a big influence on their perception and therefore the results of the call. So what the LEP perceives as fair is a neutral interpreter, so one where they do not perceive any kind of bias. A call where the agent, as we said before, remains patient and calm, and a call where the interpreter appears focused, where it's clear that they're using correct terminology, they appear knowledgeable about, as Ali mentioned, the forms and the disclosures, that the interpreter is really focused on the call. In contrast, the LEP will walk away with a feeling that the call has been unfair if, for example, they perceive agent-interpreter side talk. So if the interpreter has a long discussion with the agent in language and the LEP doesn't know what's being said. If the agent or the interpreter cuts the LEP off, that makes them feel like they're not being heard. And finally, if there are lots of background noises, and this is typically an issue that we try to reinforce with our interpreters, but in today's world, a lot of agents are working at home as well. So it's important for the agents also to ensure that there is no background noise like people talking, a television, a dog barking. That all gives the LEP the impression that their speech and their concerns are not being taken seriously. So when a call becomes heated or emotional, which often happens in these sensitive calls, as a consumer of interpretation services, there are a few things that you should expect both from your provider and their interpreters. For example, the interpreters will and should ask before interpreting profanity. As Ali mentioned before, their task is to retain the register of the discussion, and if it includes a lot of slang, they include a lot of slang. They typically don't interpret profanity without requesting permission from the agent first. Your interpreter will, as we said, convey the emotional register of the LEP within reason. The interpreter won't be screaming if the LEP is screaming, but they will definitely convey that emotion. And the interpreter will and should ask for clarification or repetition as needed. And that often happens in a heated discussion when people start to talk over each other. The agent and the interpreter both need to work to calm the discussion down and make sure that each utterance is able to be interpreted. On the flip side, the interpreter will not serve as an advocate for the LEP. That should not happen. There are some exceptions to that rule, particularly in medical situations where the interpreter is called upon to act as a cultural broker. That's something a little bit different, where they may explain a cultural consideration that the doctor, for example, doesn't know, so that the medical interaction can go forward. But in general, the interpreter is not advocating for the LEP. They're a neutral third party. We would not expect the interpreter to become emotionally involved, and we would never expect the interpreter to provide their opinion, even if asked. And this does happen sometimes, where the LEP, feeling a connection to the interpreter because here's someone who speaks their language, the LEP may say, "What do you think I should do?" And the interpreter should be trained and should never provide their opinion about the contents of the call.
One thing we train our interpreters specifically to say in that instance is, I'm sorry, but I am just the interpreter and I can't provide an opinion for you. And they need to inform the agent that the LEP did ask them that. So we want to talk about a few specific examples that we've seen, some case studies of real calls that Lionbridge interpreters have handled, and we've observed the call become difficult or sensitive or both. Often they go together. And we have a couple different industries that we'll talk about. The first one is a telecommunications customer that we work with. And these calls have become very difficult during the pandemic as people struggle financially. They're not able to pay their bills and they're calling in asking for relief or extensions. And the agents on the phone are often not able, with this client, to make that kind of determination for them. The LEP has ended up being transferred around many times, and they're getting very upset with the experience. They're stressed out because of the global pandemic and their financial situation. Elizabeth Ledesma is our quality assurance lead here at Lionbridge, and she has observed many of these calls. We do live call monitoring here at Lionbridge for quality assurance. And she says that what has made all the difference for this client is that they have their agents trained very well to be professional and kind at all times. And that has been just the difference. The night and day difference is if the agent starts to show frustration in their voice, then the LEP gets more upset and the interpreter is stuck in the middle. And of course, this may seem obvious, but it makes the interpreter's job so much easier when the agent is unflappable and the interpreter can keep the conversation running smoothly. I'm sure you can all imagine how in a situation where even without an interpreter, when emotions get heightened, it becomes difficult for the agent to maintain control of the call. Just multiply that with the interpreter. So as long as the agent is staying calm, that will give everyone the best result. And you can see that Elizabeth's quote here, she says that even though the LEP in these situations is often not getting what they wanted or what they called in to request, everybody can respect each other. The call goes smoothly because the agent was there being very firm but very polite and kind, and that's what's made the difference. So any call where you're dealing with financial insecurity, we find that that's been a huge help. Our next example is a state benefits agency. We have a particular call that stood out to our lead interpreter, Alvaro. He was recalling that there was a mother who was in a hearing because her coverage claims had been denied for a specialized piece of medical equipment that her son needed. She was very upset. It was sort of word against word of what had gone on in prior hearings, and the LEP was crying throughout the call, and Alvaro is a father, and he was feeling emotionally drained by the call a little bit. And what helps him, and what we've trained our interpreters to do, is to try to move your mind away from the emotion and really focus on the accuracy of your interpretation. So he says here, I knew I had to make sure the message was conveyed the right way. I prioritized accurate and complete renditions. And of course, as we talked about earlier, the LEP was crying. The interpreter's mandate is to convey the emotion of the speaker, but he's not going to start crying during the call, of course, but he puts some of that tone into his voice and really focuses on the accuracy, and that's how he was able to get through this call. So in addition to the agent needing to be unflappable, the interpreter really needs to be unflappable, and we do recommend that you speak with your language service provider about whether they have specific training in place for interpreters on how to manage these types of calls so that they know, take a breath if you need one, focus on the quality of your interpretation, these types of tips that we train our interpreters on that we find have been very helpful. Finally, we have a medical case study. Medical calls, of course, are always sensitive by nature. In this particular case that we're talking about, we have a managed long-term care facility that we're working with, which tends to be elderly LEPs, and they do have to do data intake over the phone, and this can lead to challenges. Our interpreter, Marco, was recalling a specific call where the agent from the facility really was just asking over and over again for the LEP's social security number, and she couldn't remember it. And so in this particular case, that was really escalating the tension, and Marco, as an experienced interpreter, knew that it was time to step in, and he had to intervene. He explained to the agent what the LEP was, more about what she was saying. She said, I can't remember, I'm so old, I need help, so he took a break from the flow of the call to reiterate to the agent that they weren't making progress by asking the same question over and over again, and could she potentially escalate the call or find a different resolution. And sometimes those things are appropriate and sometimes they're not, and it takes an experienced interpreter or agent to know when to break from your standard call flow, right? So we find that it's important that if you have specific examples of ways that your call flow can be adapted and that you can share that with the interpreter in advance, as we discussed, that's really helpful. Of course, agent training about knowing when to take further action within the call is the most important piece of this. So we try to train our interpreters that same way, mirror the expectations of the agent, but if the call has really gotten out of control, that may be time to step in. So that is the main content that we wanted to review with you. We'd like to open it up to questions. We hope this has been helpful, and we are happy to discuss further about how we handle sensitive calls.
Thank you, Allie and Susan. And to everyone on the line, you can submit questions to the chat box and I'll read them out loud to them. We did have a few come in while you were speaking. Considering the probable urgency of such calls, is it common for interpreters to receive resources, scripts, glossary, screenshots, etc., before a call?
Yeah, I can take that. This would typically be at the management level for your buyer company, that while you're onboarding with your language service provider, or anytime, if you have a business review or whatever the ongoing relationship with your provider is, that those people should be getting as much information to the language service provider in advance as they can. So for example, when we're onboarding a new customer for interpretation service here at Lionbridge, we discuss this during the onboarding. Do you have forms? Do you have glossaries? Do you have scripts? Then we blast email those to all our interpreters before the new customer goes live with our service, and we post them in the interpreter reference material portion of our website so that they can access those materials to study in advance and then to access live during the call as needed. So yeah, you're exactly right. If there's something that they need during the call that they don't already have, it's going to be challenging. The best way to deal with that is to just take it very slow so that the interpreter's only doing 1 or 2 sentences at a time. If they don't understand a term, they can pause to ask for repetition or clarification. So if they don't have the reference material in front of them, the call, it will still be fine with your experienced interpreters, but it needs to be taken a little bit slower.
Thank you. When you do live call monitoring, does everyone on the line need to be made aware of this?
We typically manage that, again, with the customer preference. Most of our customers that we work with right now already have that disclosure in their IVR. This call may be monitored. That's sometimes in language, depending on how sophisticated your telephony system is. Sorry, for IVR, meaning the menu that your LEPs are hearing as they're dialing in to talk to you. If that's not already included, you may want to have the agent start the interpretation portion of the call by saying, this call may be monitored, and then the interpreter may say this call may be monitored. So that's something that we would typically discuss on a customer by customer basis. We can certainly put into our menu that type of language also, so it just depends on the customer's preference.
We do also have instances where we don't we would have a customer who could opt out of monitoring. I mean, I think
Oh, yes.
that's important to give the customer that ultimately it's their decision. For example, if you had or have special kinds of monitors, if you had a customer in the government space who required cleared interpreters, then the monitors would have to be cleared as well. So as Ali said, something to work out with customers so that the monitoring program meets their particular specifications as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Now, can you explain if COVID has changed the way Lionbridge thinks about sensitive calls?
Yes, Susan, do you want to take that one?
Sure, absolutely. Because we do a lot of work with healthcare and medical customers as well as government customers, this has become a big concern for for all of our customers. And at Lionbridge, we've really taken this as a mission to be part of this effort to bring equity to the whole process of helping COVID patients, helping people get tested, and also, of course, the vaccine distribution. So it's definitely a focus for us. Of course, the thing that we did first and that we continue to do is to provide COVID specific training to our interpreters, because it is a different set of terminology than typical medical interactions, for example. So by providing some and continuing to provide some additional resources and training, we make sure that the interpreters are COVID ready, so to speak. But the other interesting thing is that everybody's at home now. So whereas before, a lot of our customers had their agents, their callers in a call center or in an office of some sort, those agents are now at home too. So there's sort of a double priority of how to make the call as distraction free and noise free as possible. So whereas I think I mentioned this earlier, whereas before the interpreters were the ones we really concentrated on in terms of having a quiet workspace and having a space where you wouldn't be interrupted with anything distracting, we see that on the agent side now too. So I think it does, it ramps up the stress level and the sensitivity level for all calls, because the agents, of course, are going through their own challenges due to COVID, and everybody's a little bit more on edge. So absolutely, it's a different world, and what will be interesting to see is, as we come out of the pandemic, how many of these workflows and conditions remain.
Great, thank you, Susan. We had a few questions come in about video, so I'm going to try and combine them together. Does Lionbridge do video calls? And if so, how is OPI different than VRI in terms of what we discussed today, protocols, rules, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. They're very similar in most respects. We do offer VRI also. VRI stands for Video Remote Interpretation. We have the same training available for all our interpreters. Some are qualified for video, others aren't if they aren't comfortable on video or whatever their preference is. So we would set that up on the interpreter level, but they have access to the same training. And most of the content is the same. You know, they're just additional considerations for interpreters who are going to be on video. Of course, the role of the interpreter, generally, they need to have a neutral background, professional dress, you know, those aspects that aren't relevant in a phone-only call. But in terms of the sensitivity or difficulty of the content, the added challenge, of course, is that, you know, if you're as the interpreter, if you're feeling very emotional during the call, you have to learn to control your face also. And that's just, you know, that's part of the work of a video interpreter, and they're used to it. But that's really the added difference in terms of the interpreter's role in a difficult or sensitive video call, is maintaining that same distance and neutrality in your facial expressions.
Thank you. And what kinds of training programs does Lionbridge have for your interpreters?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we onboard our interpreters, we have a variety of different training packages depending on which set of customer calls they're going to be working on. For example, medical training for interpreters who are going to be working with our medical customers, et cetera. And we decide which interpreters are working with which customer sets based on the results of their interpretation skills testing and their experience and so forth. We have also different pools for US-based and non-US based interpreters. So depending which pool of interpreters the new candidate will be joining, they undergo up to 40 hours of training with Lionbridge before they get started. That includes generally review of the customer materials that we've been discussing. They need to understand who they're going to be working with right away. It's also general interpreter protocol. This, again, the same things we discussed today. You're expected as a Lionbridge interpreter to speak in the first person. We have a standard greeting they need to learn, closing, all of these protocol pieces. We also have generalized briefings around this is what a community interpreter should be doing. These are the types of calls you may encounter, that sort of thing. And there's also ethics testing that we do at Lionbridge. If an LEP asks you your opinion, what should you do? We have a test for that. So all of that is part of the onboarding training. And then depending which pool the interpreters are part of, they may be subject to annual training. Oh, privacy training, I didn't mention that. There's specific confidentiality and privacy training that's part of the onboarding package also. And then for some pools, we have interpreters redo that training annually and so forth. I think those are the main categories would be, interpreter protocol, ethics, confidentiality, privacy, interpretation skills. We have that those types of trainings available all the time for our interpreters, consecutive interpretation skill building exercises, and then customer specific content. Susan, did I leave anything out? That's a big question.
No, that's I don't think so.
Technology, that's another one. Technology training for, especially in this time for OPI, VRI, remote interpreters. We do technology screening and we need to make sure that they have the right equipment. So we have training reference materials available for different equipment recommendations that we have.
Becky, any additional questions?
It looks like Becky may have lost audio.
Oh, okay. Well, those were all great questions, and anybody who's attending, if we didn't get to yours or there's something you think of later, feel free to, you can reach out to us. The contact information, I believe, will be included in the webinar that's sent out tomorrow, just the recording of the webinar. So feel free to reach out to Allie or to me, and we'd be happy to answer your questions or provide you with any additional information. All right, well, I guess we will end things here since I think Becky's having a little bit of technical challenge. So thank you all so much for attending. We really appreciate it. We think this is a really important topic, particularly now, and we're very happy to have the chance to talk to you all about it.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Have
much.
a good day.
Bye.